I consider us ridiculously lucky to have her in Wolfville, Nova Scotia, of all places, and I want to share a few highlights of her life's work with you. Dr. Shiva is a prominent environmental, social justice, anti-GM, seed security, and women's rights crusader. She's a physicist, a philosopher, the author of over 20 books and over 500 essays. She's a university educator, and she's the founder of 2 prominent NGOs. She's incredibly insightful and inspiring, and she has this amazing ability to analyze complex issues clearly, and then frankly but warmly share them with audiences so they can understand them too. Ms. Magazine says, Dr. Shiva has devoted her life to fighting for the rights of ordinary people of India. Her fierce intellect and her disarmingly friendly, accessible manner have made her a valuable advocate for people all over the developing world. And Atney Reader states that she is a leading thinker who has eloquently blended her views on the environment, agriculture, spirituality, and women's rights into a powerful philosophy. Dr. Shiva is the founder of Vandana, which means 9 seeds or 9 crops. And it's a network of seed keepers and organic producers across over 16 states in India. And amazingly, they have 65 community seed banks established, and they've trained over 5,000 farmers in seed saving and organic production methods. The freedom of farmers to save seed, to breed their own locally adapted open pollinated varieties, and to exchange that seed freely, free from contamination of genetic modification. That is where the work of Vandana and Seeds of Diversity Canada and other organizations like ours come together. And I would say, in fact, it's where the work of many of us in Nova Scotia and in Kings County who are working on food and seed issues, we are inspired from those same basic moral premises as well. I'm proud to know and to have looked around the room and see how many people here tonight are engaged in this important work and are supporting organizations and producers who are building capacity for this to keep expanding. Finally, I brought up with me a book that was a friend to me, and I reread it many times when I was a young, aspiring academic myself. It's called Healing the Wounds, and it's a collection of essays published in 1989 on ecofeminism. It was one of the first books, I think it was the first collection in North America, edited by a woman in BC, looking for the first time at the world's leading thinkers who had something to say about the connections between the environment and women's rights. And Dr. Shiva has an article in this book. So her inspiration to me has been with me for over 20 years. And she taught me, among many things, like I said, that biodiversity is our key form of food security, and that the free and accessible exchange of seeds and open pollinated varieties in particular is the basis of that biodiversity. I thank her for the wisdom and passion and unstoppable quest for justice that she instills in me and other seed savers and the board of Seeds of Diversity Canada. I can't think of a better way to spend the next 3 days of my life, which I'm going to do, shamelessly following her around the province, soaking up her words of wisdom. So won't you join me in welcoming the inspiring Dr. Vandana Shiva.
Thank you very much, Michelle, Michael, and all of you. I think this is the capital of the new Canada. I was invited to Calgary for a Peace Prize, and all I could hear was the misery that the tar sands are causing. And of course, there's all the wealth coming out of that destruction. But that, I don't think, is the future. It's the work you all are doing here. And in the one day I've spent on my journey through Nova Scotia, I can see this place bursting with new energy. I've always said that when the dominant system is rotting, it's good to be on the margins because you're that much further from the rot. And of course, the dominant system of food and agriculture has become extremely rotten, both literally and figuratively. It's rotting the planet. The environmental club of this school is working on creating wells, establishing wells in India. I have watched in my lifetime the groundwater disappear as more and more water is sucked out for chemical farming, mistakenly called the Green Revolution. It was not green, it was not revolutionary. All it was the deployment of war chemicals to farming. And 70% of the water abuse on the planet is for a non-sustainable industrial system of agriculture. It's polluting our rivers, it's depleting our aquifers, and it is literally closing the future of farming. Michelle talked about how 70% of the biodiversity of agriculture has been destroyed, largely because of industrial monocultures. In 95, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization organized a major conference on plant genetic resources to take stock of what was happening. And country after country, the data showed that introduction of the new industrial varieties as industrial monocultures was wiping out the biodiversity of indigenous crops and the varieties within them. And I've learned over the last few years how much we had and how much we are losing and how much needs saving. India used to have 200,000 rice varieties. It's quite unbelievable. And when I started to save seeds 25 years ago, since then we've rescued 3,000. The so-called high-yielding varieties of the Industrial Revolution were bred for only one thing: how to respond to chemicals. They should actually be called high-response varieties because they're not high-yielding in and of themselves. And the basic trick was to create dwarf varieties to be able to withstand higher doses of chemicals, because native varieties grow tall, they give you a lot of straw, which you need for the soil, for the animals, and a balance of grain and straw. But when you apply chemicals to these varieties, they have the problem of lodging. And this was only overcome by engineering the plant, not genetically engineering it, but crossing it in order to be able to take up higher doses. And over the years, I've seen how there's been a fodder scarcity created. Years ago, when there was a drought in southern India, I looked at the data and found there was no drop in rainfall. So I rushed to this region and started to figure out how could there be a drought when there was no drop in rainfall. And there was this old farmer who said to me, "Daughter, bring me back my old sorghum seeds and I will drive away the drought." Because the tall plants had so much straw that that biomass could be returned to the soil. When it was in the soil, it could hold the water. And when it could hold the water, the drought didn't have the same impact. But the dwarf varieties returned nothing to the soil. There was no organic matter, no water holding capacity, and the rain came, but it all ran off. Nothing went back into the soil. And so I promised that old farmer, I'll bring the old variety back. We found it, we got it back to him, and that was actually my first seed collection. Among the 3,000 varieties of rice we have saved were varieties that people used to say, but they are no use, they're low yielding. And my philosophy was, neither nature nor our ancestors were stupid. If there's a variety, it's because it has a place on this beautiful planet. And then we realized in 1999 that salt-tolerant varieties that had no role in the Green Revolution were precisely the kind of varieties we needed during climate change. Because the cyclones were intensifying, the salt water was coming deeper, and we did a huge rescue operation after what is called the Orissa super cyclone, which killed 30,000 people. And then the farmers of this area started to grow these salt-tolerant varieties. And when the tsunami happened in 2004, we were able to take 2 truckloads of seed to distribute. And farmers were able to do agriculture, even though the agriculture department had felt for 5 years we are stuck till the salt gets washed away. So there is no diversity that is useless. Something can withstand a drought, something has tremendous taste. Narrow measurement of high yield with respect to chemicals alone is part of a primitive breeding paradigm that we need to give up. We need to move on to breeding for nutrition, breeding for health, breeding for water conservation, breeding for climate resilience. There's so many reasons why we need our plants, and there's so many reasons why the plants need our care. My work on climate change and agriculture showed me that 40% of the greenhouse gases that are causing climate instability are coming from industrial globalized agriculture. If you do the breakdown according to the different categories, in both the United Nations IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the Stern Report, that's the figure. So about 70% of the water problem, the land degradation problem, the biodiversity erosion problem, 40% of the climate problem is coming from an agriculture that is not suited to this planet, to the ecological processes through which the planet renews her capacity to feed us, her capacity to provide water, her capacity to renew biodiversity. But a very deep crisis that is related to this is the fact that this is an agriculture without people. The whole design is to replace people with either toxic chemicals or fossil fuels. The replacement of people with fossil fuels and chemicals is on the one hand giving us the ecological crisis, but on the other hand it's giving us an agrarian crisis of a very, very deep kind. And the agrarian crisis is both the disappearance of small farms, and in the case of my country, which has within a decade been told that you shouldn't have farmers anymore, we see a new tragedy emerge, something we've never experienced. When they started the Green Revolution in India, the Western experts used to say, oh, the Indian peasant is a fatalist. They accept anything. Well, today the Indian peasant has been so burdened by the invisible costs of a false prosperity, of a high input agriculture, especially seeds that are now not only commodities, but seeds that are property, intellectual property. And it was the defining of seed as intellectual property that got me involved in seed saving and starting Navdanya, because a patent on seed is granted on the assumption that seed is an invention. But seed isn't an invention. Seed is centuries of evolution, both cultural and biological. And the mere fact that you can put a gene to produce a toxin like Bt or resist herbicides like Roundup is mutilation of the seed. It's not the creation of the seed. I often say, instead of rewarding companies like Monsanto with patents, they should be held accountable as polluters. And that's why Percy Smyther's case is so important, because they turned the principle of the polluter pays on its head and said the polluter will get paid. They'll spread the contamination and then say, your crop is mine, you pay me a fine, and they've gone after farmers like Percy. About 1970-98, Monsanto started to put huge ads in Indian papers about their Bolgard cotton, which is the trade name for Bt cotton, and talked about how Indian farmers would be having this miracle seed. I know the laws of my land, so I rang up our ministries and said, did they get an approval? And the ministry said, no, we don't know what Monsanto is, we don't know what Bt is, nobody came to us. So I took the case to the Supreme Court, I sued. And I said, this is illegal. So they couldn't for 4 years commercialize the Bt, but they started to buy up the Indian seed companies or lock them into licensing arrangements. Within 10 years, they controlled the cotton seed market, 95%. We used to have 1,500 varieties of cotton. Now there's only Bt cotton, Bt cotton, Bt cotton in the market. And this seed is so costly, it's not renewable, it's unreliable. Sometimes farmers take on credit seed 3 times in a season because their crop keeps failing, either because of a drought or a disease attack or a pest attack. The price jumped 8,000%. And of course, the claim is this is going to be a miracle crop, there's never going to be the need to spray. New pests have required spraying 13 times more than on conventional cotton. So you've got 8,000% increase in seed costs, 1,300% increase in pesticide costs. These seeds need irrigation. Very often the farmer will borrow to drill a well for irrigation. And within a season or two, the farmer is in such deep debt that they can't pay back. And when the creditors, who are the agents for seed sales and chemical sales, come to the farmer and say, your land is now mine, that's the day the farmer will go quietly to his field, drink a bottle of pesticide, and end his life. And the figure for farmer suicides in India, according to the government, is 250,000 in the last decade and a half. But this is absolutely unnecessary, because we've started to save seeds in these areas where the suicides are. We help farmers go organic, and farmers using their own seeds and doing organic farming are earning between 2 to 10 times more than the farmers using Bt cotton. And nobody gets into debt. Nobody gets into debt for an ecological farming system that doesn't depend on credit for purchased inputs. Another aspect of the crisis that the current system, the current dominant system, has left us with is the crisis of hunger. We've never in human history had 1 billion people permanently hungry. There's been hunger before because there was a war, because there was a natural catastrophe, because you became refugees, but you always overcame hunger. And hunger has always been localized in space and time. Now it's permanent. And in my view, it's permanent because it's built into the design of an agriculture based on greed. Farmers are forced to buy more and more inputs. They're getting into debt. They're growing something for the market, usually a commodity. And at least in our context in the third world, they're not eating what they grow because they have to sell it to pay back the debt. And I have watched farmers growing rice and selling every grain. and then buying rice to feed themselves at 4 to 10 times the price. Because that's the difference between what a farmer gets for their produce and then what the retail price of rice is in the market. So in this period, where India, of course, looks extremely prosperous when you only look at growth indicators, India has not just become the capital of farmer suicides, but it's become the capital of hunger. Every fourth Indian is today hungry, and one of the most outrageous figures that to me is absolutely unacceptable is the fact that every second child in India is technically wasted, which means they are so undernourished that they'll never grow up to be full human beings mentally and physically. So if you look at the world picture, most of the grain in the world is being used up for biofuel and animal feed. That's where most of the corn and soya is going. And even in India, where Monsanto is now trying to push corn in a very big way, 75% of the corn is going for animal feed and the starch industry, not for human beings. So you can keep growing more cereals, but if it's more profitable to collect subsidies for biofuel or have higher returns from cattle feed, that food won't be eaten by people. And one of the most shocking figures is the fact that of the billion people who are hungry today, half of them are growers of food who are not getting to eat what they grow. And there's the other side to malnutrition, which is the epidemic of obesity. India is also now the capital of diabetes. We work with schools. And in '95, when we started our school programs, 7% of the school-going children of Delhi were obese. It jumped to 14% in 2005, and last year it had jumped to 25%. Children at 7 and 8 are getting adult-onset diabetes, and it's all related to a bad food system. Now, if we had governments that were really serving the people, neither the agriculture that's killing the planet and our farmers, nor a food system that is denying health to people would be allowed. Unfortunately, part of what globalization did was, in a way, reduce the role of governments in regulating those who are responsible for ecological destruction, nutritional destruction, health destruction, the destruction of our countryside, the destruction of our biodiversity, our water. Now, this is the present. And if, as we look ahead, there are two futures of food. There's the future you're creating here. There's the future we are creating in India with Vandana. And that's the future we need to build. But those who have created the current disaster are very busy turning the current crisis into their next opportunity. And so they're trying to make us believe that the solution to the food crisis and the agrarian crisis is to further destroy the land, the soil, the biodiversity. I call this paradigm the paradigm that has mutated food into anti-food. I had a debate with a very eminent Italian scientist in an annual event that's organized by a major food, the biggest pasta company in Italy called Barilla. And Veronesi is his name. And I was talking about how you can't have real food without real farmers. And he turns around and says, no, we just have to accept the fact that farms will disappear, farmers will disappear, and we'll be living from pills. But even more interesting was this person called Craig Venter, who a few years ago patented the entire human genome. I don't know how many of you remember that. And people from across the Atlantic were saying, but how can you patent the genome? He didn't know what the different parts of the genome do. He just took a patent. And now he's leading something that comes after genetic engineering, which is synthetic biology. And genetic engineering was sold to us as the miracle that's going to feed the world. We've just done a report that was released at the end of the year. Vandana working with about 30 organizations across the world, and we prepared a report on the state of GMOs. Because, I knew that cotton isn't doing well in India and through genetic engineering. I knew in Mexico there's contamination of corn in the heart of diversity. In Argentina, agriculture has as good as disappeared. It's a green desert. So we said, let the movements of different regions write their reports. And at the end of it, it came out that the 4 claims that are made by Monsanto are all false. The first is the claim of producing more food. This is the only way the world will be fed. There is no evidence that genetic engineering increases production. It actually leads to a decline. The second claim was this is going to be the alternative to chemical use. It has led to an increase in herbicide use and pesticide use. The third claim was by controlling weeds and pests, there would be more food production. Instead, we have super pests and super weeds. And what is the most significant is through genetic engineering, seed patents have allowed Monsanto to take control of a very large domain of the seed supply, including non-genetically modified seed. And among the many cases I have fought on something called biopiracy. We call biopiracy the patenting of the biodiversity and knowledge that exists. The first case we fought was against the patenting of neem, which is a wonderful tree that we use for natural pest control. And we fought that case for 11 years and won it against the US Department of Agriculture and a big company called W.R. Grace. And then was the beautiful basmati that comes from my valley. And basmati means the queen of aroma. And a company in Texas called Rice Tech, thinking if you add tech, then you can steal anyone's rice, claim to have invented the rice, the aroma, the seed, even methods of cooking rice. We fought that one and had most of the claims dropped. And then Monsanto claimed an old Indian wheat variety with low gluten. We forced them to drop that patent. They're now patenting an ancient Indian melon variety. And we've just initiated another case to force them to drop that patent. But they have set their minds on owning all the seed of the planet, because what could be more convenient than taking a patent and sitting back and collecting royalties? Our calculations are that for cotton alone from India, they're collecting 10 billion rupees, which is approximately $500 million every year. Just one crop. They have to do nothing. Just own the seed, own the trait, and then the royalties flow. And they've designed the future on the basis of this royalty flow. So genetic engineering didn't do a good job. The Green Revolution has failed. And to continue on that path of monocultures, more intensive chemical interventions, more narrow understanding of the farming system won't go further. But I just noticed that there is a new program initiated by the National Science Foundation and the Gates Foundation. And Mr. Gates really thinks he has to set the future of food. He's quite obsessed with it. He started an alliance for the green revolution in Africa, which is based only on two things: introducing chemical fertilizers and genetically modified seeds on a very fragile continent. So they financed this program, which my friends were very excited, and they said, oh, you know, they're going to fund integrated pest control in farming, and that sounds like the kind of work you do. Well, you know what it's for? And they call the program BREAD. All of the grants are related to creating synthetic organisms, viruses and bacteria, in order to deal with the viruses and bacteria that have been created by a non-sustainable system of farming. And why has this happened? Because the plant is too complex. They can't deal with anything but bacteria. And when I debate the synthetic biologists, they eventually admit, yeah, we can't deal with plants, we can't deal with higher life forms. But they've decided they're going to define the world as being built with bio bricks. Literally, it's a bio bricks. And we're going to build life brick by brick. They haven't managed too much, but they're claiming the future. And can you imagine if the future of bread is only the shit of bacteria? I mean, they'd like to produce food in huge giant vats and say, eat this. It's healthy for you. They call it nutraceuticals. And there's a new convergence of nutraceuticals, which is nutrition without agriculture, and so-called healthcare. So Mr. Craig Venter, who gets most of these grants, talks about personalized medicine. And what's personalized medicine? They'll put a chip inside you, and they'll decide what you're deficient in. And then they'll have instructions from remote control to release the right amount of doses. But if they couldn't understand the plant, how will they understand the human body? And that's why we need to step back and recognize, first, that the nature of any living system is complexity. And second, that the nature of anything that's alive is self-organization. And that means narrow engineering paradigms are totally ill-suited to a world of creating living food. So what has the dominant system given us? It's turned living seed into dead seed. You know, there's all these attempts to introduce Terminator seed. And it wasn't for Pat Mooney and his group. And I remember I came to do a Terminator hearing in Ottawa at the Parliament to get a ban, which we have. But you can't tell, because the companies don't tell anyone, including governments, how they are breeding, what technologies they're using. Food itself has been turned either into dead food or food that destroys our health. Soils are being killed. This is not a future of food. It can be a future that destroys food. And that is why we have to reclaim food. And I'm so happy that the Occupy movement decided that the 27th is going to be a day dedicated to occupying the food system. And I'm so happy to be here in Nova Scotia to celebrate that with you. We've been repeatedly told farmers can't shape the future of food. Only farmers can, because they live with the living systems that give us food. We've been told that open pollinated seeds aren't productive enough. Our work in Vandana has shown that systems based on native seeds, ecological intensification, biodiversity intensification, can feed 2 Indias. We can produce enough nutrition. And we've shifted our measures. We said, no, it's not good enough to measure the yield of a commodity. We are going to measure the nutrition and health that an agriculture system produces. And we're now working on what is the wealth that's created through sustainable local food systems. And you are such a good example to show that local food systems are bringing wealth into the community rather than the non-local, globalized, commoditized systems which are sucking wealth out of rural communities. They are like giant vacuum cleaners, leaving rural communities in debt and then depopulation. We've got to put nature and people back into the equation for the future of food. Those are the 2 elements and aspects that have been driven out. But most importantly, we've got to put the future back into the future of food. And the future can only come, as one of the slides that the Environmental Club had prepared, thinking about future generations. Our civilization in India, the Native American civilizations, had always had the concept of the 7th generation. When you take any step, bring the 7th generation to your mind. And if whatever you do will leave a positive legacy, then do it. And if it will leave harm, then don't. I'm part of a council called the World Future Council. And it's only it has a single objective, thinking for the future. One of the things we are trying to build, and I hope all of you from this school will become part of it, is demand an ombudsman for future generations. Because there are too many crimes being created against the future generations. I'm also hoping that in this year, and as part of my visit here to all of you who are already engaged in these issues, we can strengthen the movement for seed sovereignty. It is now recognized that there won't be food security if there isn't food sovereignty. Food security won't come out of global speculation on food commodities. It will not come from commodities that can drive a car one day, feed a chicken the next day. It'll come from nurturing food as food, serving it with love, as we had this wonderful dinner at the Tempest today. And one of our ancient texts that I love is something called Taittiriya Upanishad. And it basically says that the highest dharma is the growing and giving of good food. There's no dharma above it. And that's the right action, that's the right thing to do. Now, you can't have food sovereignty without seed sovereignty. And it is the seed that is today the subject of control. The corporations recognize that if you control the seed, you control the food. If you control the food, you control people. And that's why if you have to have democracy, we've got to have food democracy. And if you've got to have food democracy, you've got to have seed freedom. I hope within this year we'll be able to create a global network of seed savers and seed defenders. And I'd love the young people to be part of this global network. I'd love to see a seed garden, a seed-saving garden, right here in the school. And for all the wells that you support in India, add a little seed saving. A well provides water. Seeds need a little bit of water. That's the best use of water, and both are reclaiming of what is the basis of the future, the reclaiming of our commons. Because in the patenting of seed is the ultimate enclosure of the commons, the ultimate privatization of life. And in bringing water to people, in saving seeds and sharing seeds, we are reclaiming the commons both for all species, for all communities, the producers and the eaters, and for future generations. One of my very, very inspiring poems came out of Palestine. And the poet is no more, but he wrote, "You can destroy my village. You can drop bombs and kill our culture. You can destroy every tree till no bird, no insect, no word has a place to hide. I do not fear your tyranny. I do not despair ever, because I have one seed that I will plant and grow again." Thank you. I think the biggest dialogue is the practice itself. And for every farm that is organic, for every local food community that prospers, the dialogue is already started. And it is so important to not just have the verbal dialogue and the verbal debate, but to build these alternatives that speak for themselves. I have never seen any community that's got trapped into the GM and chemical treadmill, smiling faces, hope for the future. I see it here in your communities. That, to me, is already a dialogue. Through most of history, women have been the seed savers. And when I started seed saving, I was absolutely amazed at how sophisticated the expertise was. In a tribal village where I went, women will take exactly 21 seeds, put it into the soil. After a week, take it out to see how many germinated. If all 21 germinated, they have a particular seed rate. If one didn't, they increase it slightly. And if 3 didn't, they take seed from a neighbor. That's not the level of germination in any of the commercial seed supply that we have today. But there's another element that's not just about seed saving historically and traditionally. Ultimately, seed saving is about care. You know, one of our seed keepers and seed coordinators for Orissa, where we have more than 650 varieties of rice, Kusum, who's the seed keeper, when she talks in workshops to farmers, she says 2 beautiful things. First, she says, every seed is a child. And you've got to look after it like you take care of a child. And the culture of care is, of course, the culture that women were left to protect. It's not biologically in women only, it's in men too. But the sustenance economy, as I call it, taking care of children, the old, the household, it ended up over time in the sexual division of labor to be largely the work of women. So there's a care economy that we need to build with respect to the seed. And the other thing Kusum will always say is, when you have children, every child is precious. You don't say you're 1 inch too short and therefore I'll get rid of you. You know, or you're too fat or you're too thin. And if your seeds are your children, then every one of them has to be loved and looked after and protected and reproduced. And I think that is the culture. And like I said, it's a culture that is in all the men who are here, who are farming organically. It's on all the seed keepers, some of whom, there was this beautiful young man out there this morning. And the idea that seed saving is something for the ancients like me is not true. I think it's the future generations that are going to lead this movement. And we turn to our grandmothers. You know, I've started a school in Dehradun, started out of the seed saving and organic farming. And we run many courses, but my favorite is the Grandmother's University. Because it so happens our grandmothers knew things that are relevant for the future. I think there's certain things that are so precious that you can't degrade them through commodification. Our lives, our children, our health, our food, our seeds, our water. The commodification is a degradation. And when I talk about the future of food, it's linked very much to the future of the planet. So we have this huge contest right now between those who want to protect the planet, and as you might know, out of Bolivia grew this amazing new movement on the recognition of rights of Mother Earth. And we've prepared a declaration on the rights of Mother Earth because we realize that unless you recognize the rights of the earth, we won't be able to respect the rights of human beings and the rights of future generations, because we are dependent on the earth. And on the other hand, you've got those who commodified the seed, commodified the food, now saying, oh my gosh, the soil has capacity to absorb carbon. Let's commodify the carbon absorption capacity. The forest takes in carbon dioxide. Let's now have RED. It's called reduced emissions through deforestation, avoiding deforestation and forest degradation. But it's basically saying, now let the investors make money out of controlling the emissions from a forest or the absorption of emissions by the forest. And I don't think that kind of commodified thinking will take us too far for two reasons. One, life is too rich and too priceless to be reduced to money measurements. And secondly, any commodification reduces something that is multidimensional, multifunctional to a single function. For example, food as a commodity is just about trading in that food, not about eating it. And out of that, we've got this culture that I call the culture of turning food into rock. It's tremendous to keep it sitting on a shelf forever. I travel so much that very often after 3 months, I will open a suitcase. And once I literally had an apple sitting in my suitcase for 3 months, and it hadn't rotted. It should have rotted. Commodities are meant to not rot. They have a patent now for a tomato. The first genetically engineered food was a flavor saver tomato. And you could throw it against the wall and it would bounce right back in your hands. And they haven't given up. They've got a new patent application for a tomato that never rots. There's nothing ethical about ruining the seed, the food, and the farmer. And in my view, there's only one ethical measure: a deep and intimate relationship to the land, to those who produce food, and to our own health and our own bodies. And that ethical relationship can't be measured in a remote way by someone sitting in the Chicago Future Exchange. It has to be measured in the living community. Well, my hope comes from people like you, bubbling with energy. It comes from the abundance of biodiversity in the earth, and it comes from life. Life gives us hope. And in my view, life is a more powerful process than petty greed. When greed is turned into religion, then you have no motivation to save seeds, to look after the land, and to even produce decent food or eat it, because then there's no measure. I don't think religion alone, I don't think institutionalized religion alone is any guarantee. But I think a sense of the sacredness of life and the sacredness of seed and the sacredness of food. When I came to the sustainability fair this afternoon, the slow food table had books on the edible schoolyard. Now, this is something that's happening in urban areas. Alice Waters has had a very big role, who's the other vice president of Slow Food, along with me. I think gardens is something urban children can be as involved in as rural children. But the most important thing is ultimately we are all eating. And what we try and do with urban schools is to create a nutritional literacy, not through a heavy-handedness, but through creating an enjoyment of quality in food. And we actually run a program called Little Chefs to let young people know the joy of cooking, that this is something they can do. They don't have to eat out of something. I've never understood how people can even digest it. These frozen TV dinners. And of course, always, I think for young people, it's our responsibility is to expose them to the situations that allows them to do their own learning. I think most people have humility. It's just a few who really want to play God. And it works wonderfully for them. And I remember in a debate with Craig Venter, he said the reason we need to do synthetic biology is this whole biotech stuff has created too many biosafety regulations. And we are now accountable. So synthetic biology allows us to go under the radar. You don't have to move stuff across borders. You just send the software across borders. And part of it is that level of irresponsibility. And that's why I keep talking about food democracy as systems of accountability, of power. The second is related to the fact that none of these people know the real world. So if the Green Revolution reduced farms to a field and to one plant variety, genetic engineering reduced the plant to the genes for Bt toxins and Roundup resistance. That's all that the plant was, really a carrier of these toxic genes. And it really became a vision of from a petri dish. And with synthetic biology, life is disappearing and being reproduced by software. And then the power to manipulate out of that disengagement. And when you actually talk, you realize, my God, they don't even know the plant. They don't know a farming system. They don't know that when they casually say, and now we will make all the biofuel of the world through synthetic biology, they're still talking about taking over the land of all of Africa for the biomass that will be the raw material that will feed the feedstock. And I think there are three levels of engagement with this hubris. The first is our democratic responsibilities and rights. All that money that's going to play God is coming from tax money. And that's why the issue of people saying, where should that money go? Should it go to local food economies, organic farms, ecological agriculture, knowledge of agroecology, or should it go to one more false promise that we know is going to fail? The second is very much related to the scientific challenge, that we've seen the failure of the mechanistic paradigm. And a deepening of that paradigm is not going to get us out of the mess. A much more holistic understanding of relations, connectedness, diversity is what is needed. And the third, of course, is cultivating the culture of care so that this culture of arrogance and hubris linked to ignorance of the real world, starts to lose its space and currency in society. This very, very good book written by a physicist called Thomas Kuhn, and it's called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And it's a very important book for anyone to read. And Kuhn says in this book, old, outdated paradigms don't die because you counter them, because they have a habit of continuing to reproduce themselves. They die because they are rendered irrelevant by a new emergent paradigm.
I'd like to invite the Horton Environmental Club representatives up. They have a few gifts for you, Dr. Shiva. I'm sort of awestruck, really. I've had the most phenomenal day, and I've shared that with so many people. To have the room full, to have so much buzz and excitement happening in our community over your visit, around having your words be shared with so many people so we can go home and we can percolate and we can think and we can go and pick up more books and read some more papers and take it on to learn more and be able to make changes in how we do things is something that I'm so very grateful that we've all been able to pull together to make happen. And the gift of your presence is something that will be with me and I'm sure with everyone here for the rest of our lives. So thank you so very much. And these wonderful young women from the Horton High School who've worked so hard within their school community and the greater community to welcome you here have a few gifts of thanks.